Some nurses just don't understand that efficiency matters more than excessive documentation. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez saved a man's life with her bare hands inside his chest cavity. Seattle General's ICU hums with fluorescent cold at 0130 hours, antiseptic sharp in the filtered air, monitors beeping their steady mechanical rhythm like 1,000 digital heartbeats refusing to sync. Elena Martinez moves between beds with the practiced invisibility of someone who has spent 6 months perfecting the art of being overlooked, her scarred hands checking full lines and medication charts with military precision that borders on obsessive. Each notation is timestamped to the minute. Each drug dose logged with a kind of exactness that belongs in a surgical theater, not a civilian hospital. She favors her right leg slightly as she walks, an old injury from Ramadi that never quite healed straight, but her movements are fluid and efficient. Her scrubs are navy blue, faded from repeated washing, and cost $19 from a discount outlet store downtown. Captain James Reeves sleeps fitfully in bed 7, his chart thick with classified redactions that only Elena can read because naval intelligence sent her here specifically to watch him. 6 months embedded. 6 months of night shifts and careful invisibility. 6 months of pretending to be just another nurse while documenting everything, not for the hospital, but for the brass at Naval Security and Investigative Service. Her son Miguel served under Reeves in Ramadi, came home with 2 pieces of shrapnel still in his left shoulder and a story about a captain who went back into a firefight to carry out wounded insurgents alongside his own men. When Naval Intelligence assigned Elena to monitor Reeves for potential security breaches, she understood the irony. They wanted a mother's eyes on a man her son trusted absolutely. She pauses at his bedside now, checking the dressing on his post-surgical wound from the operation that brought him here, and her fingers drift to the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket. Miguel sent it from Ramadi with a note written in pencil on MRE packaging, "Mom, my CO carries one just like this. Says it reminds him to bring people home." The coin is rough against her palm, worn smooth in places where hands have gripped it. Not for luck. For accountability. For the weight of command. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead with the sound of 1,000 angry insects trapped in plastic casings. Elena moves to the medication station and begins her charting for the night shift, each line recorded with the precision that has slowly become her calling card in a hospital full of nurses who skip steps and abbreviate procedures. She documents every medication given, every vital sign checked, every patient interaction. The kind of charting that belongs in a teaching hospital, not routine night shift work. The kind that makes auditors sit up and compare her records against the physician's orders, looking for discrepancies. Looking for fraud. That is when Dr. Whitfield arrives for his phantom midnight rounds. He moves through the ICU like a man who owns the space, tablet in hand, barely glancing at the patients in their beds while he documents consultations that never happened. Phantom visits. Billing codes for specialists who never examined anyone. The system that has made him wealthy. Elena has seen the pattern, she was trained to see patterns, and her meticulous charting has begun to attract the attention of auditors who cross-reference her documentation against his. Her records are so precise that they make his phantom consultations obvious by contrast. A nurse who documents everything makes a doctor who documents nothing stand out in sharp relief. He stops at the nurse's station and pulls up her medication logs on the computer screen, his eyes narrowing as he reads through 3 hours of her work. His jaw tightens. He scrolls through another hour. Then another. When he turns to face her, his voice carries the kind of condescension that belongs in a courtroom, measured and cutting and designed to establish dominance. She is standing 3 feet away, holding a cup of coffee that is still steaming. "Your charting is excessive, Ms. Martinez," he says. The name is deliberate, not her first name, which he has never used. This notation of every single medication check. Every blood pressure reading. It's inefficient. It wastes hospital resources. We're not running a research facility here. Elena's jaw tightens imperceptibly. Her hand around the coffee cup remains steady. No tremor. No flush of anger rising in her chest that he might see. She has been trained by men in combat to absorb insults without flinching, to take fire without returning it unless ordered to do so. This is nothing. This is a man with a tablet and a billing scheme trying to establish dominance over a woman he has no idea he is standing next to. She returns to her work without acknowledging him. Does not defend her charting. Does not explain that precision saves lives and prevents billing fraud. Does not say a single word. The silence is her composure, and it is absolute. Dr. Whitfield waits for a response. When none comes, he turns and walks toward the break room, his tablet under his arm, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor like the punctuation mark of a threat. He passes Elena without another glance. Elena stands at the medication station for exactly 4 more seconds. Then she sets down her coffee cup and walks to the supply closet, a narrow space tucked behind the medication storage, windowless and quiet, where the hospital keeps boxes of gauze and rolls of tape and gloves in industrial quantities. She steps inside and closes the door. The darkness is almost complete. Almost peaceful. She allows herself 3 deep breaths while gripping the challenge coin so tightly that the edges press crescents into her palm. The coin is small but weighted, and it grounds her the way breathing ground soldiers in firefights. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. In. Hold. Out. The trembling that nobody sees is not fear. It is restraint. It is the accumulated weight of 6 months of invisibility, of playing a role, of watching a man commit fraud while his incompetence costs the hospital thousands of dollars per week. The coin reminds her why she is here. Not for the Navy. Not for naval intelligence. For Miguel, who trusted a captain enough to carry his name into battle. For Captain Reeves, who came back to save people he did not have to save. For the system that is supposed to protect them but is being stolen from by a man in expensive shoes and a watch that costs more than she makes in a month. She releases the coin and lets her hands hang at her sides. When she walks out of the supply closet, her face is composed. Her eyes are level. She returns to the medication station and retrieves her coffee, which is beginning to cool on the counter, and she carries it back to Captain Reeves's bedside to complete her charting for the night. The monitor beside his bed continues its steady electronic rhythm, beeping once every second like a metronome counting down to something neither of them can yet see. Elena sits in the chair beside his bed and opens his chart on the tablet, and her fingers move across the screen with the same precision that has already marked her as a threat to Dr. Whitfield's profitable ignorance. She documents his vital signs. His medication doses. His condition. The kind of charting that will, 6 hours from now, become a matter of life and death. But that wasn't the worst part. What she did not know yet was that Dr. Whitfield was already building a case against her. Already making calls to board members who owed him favors. Already documenting phantom patient complaints in her personnel file, complaints that never came from patients, that existed only in a spreadsheet hidden in a folder on his desktop labeled termination file. He was going to destroy her professional reputation before her meticulous charting could destroy his billing scheme. He was going to ensure that no hospital in the state would hire her again. What he did not know was that he was standing next to a legend. That the woman he had just insulted in front of the medication station was someone who had performed emergency thoracotomies under mortar fire in Ramadi. Someone whose hands had held lives together in the dust and chaos of a combat hospital that operated without electricity or running water or the luxury of time. Someone who could read a trauma patient's vital signs the way most people read subtitles, and whose decisions in a crisis had saved more lives than he could count. He had no idea that his phantom consultations and billing fraud were the least dangerous thing happening in his ICU tonight. The night deepened around Seattle General's walls. The monitors continued their steady beeping. And Elena Martinez sat beside Captain James Reeves's bed, documenting everything with the precision of someone who had been trained to see what matters, and to never forget it. The monitors continued their steady beeping. And Elena Martinez sat beside Captain James Reeves's bed, documenting everything with the precision of someone who had been trained to see what matters, and to never forget it. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of institutional brightness that only hospitals possess, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous frequency, the antiseptic smell of bleach and something chemical hanging in the corridors like a permanent fog. Elena was restocking the medication cart on the third floor when she received the message. Dr. Whitfield had requested her presence at grand rounds. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. She had learned the difference years ago. The conference room held 23 people. Residents in their short white coats arranged in a semicircle, 3 attending physicians in the back, Dr. Whitfield standing center stage with the kind of posture that came from knowing the room would listen. On the projection screen behind him, magnified to 3 feet tall, were Elena's medication logs. Not just one shift. 7 shifts. 3 weeks of her documentation, each entry detailed, each observation recorded, each medication cross-referenced against the patient's presenting symptoms. This, Dr. Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone about to deliver a performance, is what happens when we hire based on compassion rather than competence. He zoomed in on a single entry from Tuesday night, the one where Elena had documented Captain Reeves's post-operative pain levels at 15-minute intervals, noting the exact time she had administered each dose, the patient's response, the vital sign changes. Nurse Martinez apparently believed every medication requires a dissertation. Notice the timestamps. Notice the excessive detail. This is not nursing, ladies and gentlemen, this is obsessive documentation that suggests someone struggling to remember basic protocols. Elena stood at the back of the room, hands clasped behind her back, jaw muscles tightening imperceptibly. Her face revealed nothing. A resident in the front row whispered something to the attending next to him, loud enough to carry. Maybe she needs the practice. 3 other residents smirked. One made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Dr. Whitfield continued, zooming in on another entry, then another. Excessive notation wastes hospital resources. It clogs our systems. It suggests our colleagues cannot be trusted to make basic clinical decisions without written justification. I want to be clear, this standard of documentation is not what we expect at Seattle General. We are a premier facility. Elena's hands did not tremble. Her breathing remained steady. She stood there for 12 more minutes while he dissected her charting line by line, while he held up her meticulous work as an example of inadequacy, while the room learned that careful attention to detail was somehow a liability rather than a virtue. When he finished, she turned and walked out of the conference room without a word, her movements precise and controlled, the kind of control that only comes from having survived worse things than public humiliation. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 days later, Friday afternoon, Elena was at the vending machine in the break room, the one that dispensed coffee that tasted like hot water that had seen a coffee bean once, from a distance. She was reaching for her cup when Dr. Whitfield entered with 2 nurses from the cardiac unit. He paused, studying her scrubs with the kind of theatrical exaggeration reserved for performances meant to be witnessed. "Martinez," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the entire break room, "are those the budget brand from the uniform outlet?" He let the question hang there, suspended in the fluorescent silence. "I suppose proper medical attire must seem expensive on a nurse's salary. Though one would think looking professional might be worth the investment." Laughter rippled through the break room. It was the kind of laughter that comes from people who know they are watching someone be destroyed and are grateful it isn't them. Elena's hands remained steady as she retrieved her coffee. The cup was warm against her palms. She turned and walked back toward the ICU without a word, her jaw set in that particular way that meant she was holding something back, not tears, never tears, but something sharper and more dangerous. Composure. The kind of composure that only comes from knowing exactly how much damage you are capable of doing if you let yourself. The supply closet on the 4th floor was empty at 3:56 p.m. Elena stepped inside and allowed herself 3 deep breaths. Her hand went to her scrub pocket where Miguel's challenge coin rested, the tarnished silver, the weight of it, the story it carried from Ramadi where her son had stood beside Captain Reeves and watched their unit get shattered by an IED. She gripped the coin hard enough that it left an impression in her palm, a small metal star burned into her skin. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out through her mouth. She released the coin. Then she returned to Captain Reeves's bedside as though nothing had happened. Monday morning came with the sound of the hospital awakening, the breakfast carts rattling through the corridors, the elevators opening and closing with that pneumatic hiss, the overhead paging system crackling with announcements. Elena was restocking supplies in the medication room when she heard the footsteps. Two of them. Voices. One was Dr. Whitfield. The other was Officer Marcus Chen from Hospital Security, a retired Marine with 32 years of service and shoulders that still moved like he'd just come off deployment. Nurse Martinez, Whitfield's voice came through the open door, sharp and official. "These gentlemen need to speak with you." Elena turned. She had already read what was coming in the decision Whitfield had already made. She could see it in the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, the way his left hand was clenched at his side, the way he had brought security instead of handling this himself. Cowardice always dressed itself up as professionalism. 3 patients have filed complaints, Whitfield continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from a document, about your attitude. About your intensity. They reported feeling uncomfortable during their care. He looked at Officer Chen. If I receive even one more complaint about Nurse Martinez's behavior, she will need to be removed from the premises immediately. Is that understood? Elena nodded once. The complaints did not exist. They existed only in the fabricated documentation Whitfield had been constructing all week, phantom patient reports, protocol violations that had never occurred, a paper trail designed to appear official. She had seen this before, in different contexts, in different countries, in different wars. The building of a case against someone had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with narrative construction. Whitfield was constructing a narrative. And he was good at it. I understand, Elena said, her voice flat and even, the kind of voice that suggested acceptance but revealed nothing underneath. She returned to Captain Reeves's bedside without another word. The captain was awake now, consciousness returning in waves, and he watched her approach with the particular attention of someone who had also learned to read people. She adjusted his for line with the efficiency of 17 years of practice. She checked his surgical dressing, healing well, no signs of infection, the incision clean and precise. She documented everything. And as she documented, her mind was already elsewhere, already calculating, already running through the variables. That evening, after her shift, Elena accessed her personnel file from the hospital's shared system using her secure login credentials. 23 new entries in 2 weeks. Patient complaints. Protocol violations. Note suggesting she was overwhelmed by the standards of a premier facility. Each entry was timestamped, each appeared to be official, each would stand up to cursory review. Whitfield had not just begun documenting phantom violations. He had begun building an entire case. She scrolled further. An email to the hospital's malpractice insurance company. She couldn't access the full content, but the subject line was visible. Potential liability concerns regarding night shift nursing staff. An email to HR marked urgent, building a termination case. She had 72 hours. Maybe less. Elena picked up her phone and texted a number that had remained dormant for 6 months, Phoenix needs to roost. 3 words. 17 years of protocols in a message that would take 2 seconds to read. She sent it, and then she turned off the phone, removed the battery, and sat in the darkness of her apartment waiting for the machinery of naval intelligence to begin moving, knowing that when it did, nothing at Seattle General would ever be the same. The monitor screamed at 0200 hours. 3 sharp beeps that meant the human body was betraying itself, that something deep inside Captain James Reeves had torn open and was filling with blood. Elena was at his bedside in under 2 seconds. She didn't run. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez didn't run anywhere. She moved with the economical precision of someone who'd made decisions in field hospitals while mortars landed 50 meters away. The cardiac monitor spiked into the 180s. Blood pressure dropped from 110 to 87 to 62. The ventilator hissed its rhythmic complaint, but underneath it was another sound, the sound of a body shutting down, the silence of a heart struggling to pump against pressure it was never designed to withstand. Pericardial tamponade. The sac around his heart was filling with blood. In 30 seconds he'd be dead if that pressure wasn't relieved. In 60 seconds, he'd be unsalvageable. Elena didn't wait for the code team. She didn't wait for Dr. Whitfield or for anyone with an MD behind their name. She moved to the crash cart, hands already knowing where the thoracotomy tray was before she opened it. The scalpel was cool in her grip, the handle familiar as a weapon, and that's what it was, a weapon against death. She prepped the site with the kind of speed that made new nurses dizzy. Betadine swab. Sterile drape. Then she made the incision along his left anterolateral thorax, fourth intercostal space, the muscle separating under the blade like water parting around a stone. Blood welled up immediately, dark and urgent. She spread the ribs, hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this before, who'd done it in Ramadi when the only light came from muzzle flashes and the only anesthetic was adrenaline and training. The pericardium appeared, glistening and distended like a water balloon about to rupture. One more cat. The sac burst open and blood poured out, 300 milliliters of it, all that pressure that was crushing his heart released in one red rush across the blue drape. The monitor's rhythm changed. Flattened. Became chaotic. Elena's hand was inside his chest cavity now, fingers finding the heart, a muscle about the size of a fist, slick with blood, barely beating. She began direct cardiac massage, compressions from the inside, her wrist deep in his chest, feeling the coronary arteries pulse under her fingertips, feeling the chambers expand and contract against her palm. This was where most nurses froze. This was where most doctors froze. This was where the training ended and the instinct took over, the part of you that had been forged in places like Ramadi where you either moved perfectly or people died. The monitor's rhythm climbed. 60 beats per minute. 70. The blood pressure crept up, 40 systolic, then 50, then 65. Her compressions were generating perfusion, pushing oxygenated blood to his brain, his organs, his extremities. She felt his heart strengthen slightly under her fingers, felt it beginning to work again with her help, felt the moment when the organ decided to keep fighting. The ventilator wheezed its steady rhythm. Pulse oximetry climbed from 72% to 84% to 91%. Stable. That was the word the monitor was telling her. Stable. But there was another sound in the room now, the sound of Dr. Whitfield's shoes on the tile floor, the sound of him arriving at the bedside, the sound of someone who had just watched a nurse perform a surgical procedure that was, according to every protocol at Seattle General, completely unauthorized. Dr. Whitfield's face went the color of old concrete. His eyes fixed on Elena's wrist, still deep in the captain's open chest cavity, still delivering compressions, still keeping a man alive who should have been dead. For one long moment, neither of them moved. The ventilator hissed. The monitor beeped. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects. Then Whitfield pulled his phone from his pocket with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested he was already drafting the complaint in his mind, already composing the email to the state medical board, already calculating how this looked from the legal angle. Elena kept working. Her hand didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She continued the compressions with the absolute knowledge that if she stopped, if she hesitated for even 3 seconds, Captain Reeves would die, and all the political maneuvering in the world wouldn't bring him back. The code team burst through the doors, the resident, the attending from cardiothoracic, 2 nurses with equipment. They stopped when they saw her. Their eyes went wide. You didn't see this. You didn't see a night shift nurse who looked like she was supposed to be filing charts performing open cardiac massage in a way that suggested she'd done it approximately 800 times before. "I've got him stable," Elena said. Her voice was flat, professional, the voice of someone reporting a vital sign to the team. Not a request. Not an apology. A statement of fact. The attending, Dr. Miranda Reeves, no relation to the captain, one of the good ones, stepped forward and took over the compressions without a word. Elena stepped back. Her left shoulder was aching slightly. She didn't look at it. She didn't acknowledge the sensation. She moved to the monitor and watched the rhythm continue to stabilize, watched the blood pressure hold at 76 systolic, watched his oxygen saturation climb to 94%. In the background, she heard Whitfield say something into his phone about immediate investigation and state medical board and gross violation of protocol. She heard him. She processed the words. She filed them away in the same mental compartment where she'd filed every other threat, every other humiliation, every other attempt he'd made to destroy her. But right now, she was watching the EKG trace across the monitor, making sure that the line stayed where it needed to be and making sure that the man who had served under Miguel in Ramadi, Miguel, who had called Captain Reeves the only officer who ever asked my mother's name, stayed breathing. 20 minutes later, the ICU had stabilized. The captain was on continuous monitoring, his chest closed by the cardiothoracic team, his heart still working with Elena's intervention, his survival rate having jumped from 0% to maybe 60% if they could keep him from developing sepsis or going into cardiogenic shock in the next 48 hours. Elena was writing her post-procedure notes on the computer at the nurse's station, documenting everything in the meticulous detail that had made her such a problem for Dr. Whitfield. Time of arrest. Time of intervention. Specific procedure. Specific findings. Specific vital sign responses. The kind of documentation that would either save her or damn her, depending on who read it and with what agenda in mind. She was so focused on the words that she didn't notice the double doors to the psychiatric wing hadn't locked properly. She didn't notice that one of the orderlies who'd been escorting a violent patient, a soldier, actually, a former infantryman from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines who'd come back from Helmand Province with his brain rewired by IEDs and 3 tours and the kind of trauma that lived in your spine, had been overpowered in the hallway. She didn't notice that this soldier had found a toilet tank in the psychiatric bathroom and smashed it against the porcelain rim until he had an 8-inch shard of ceramic with an edge sharper than most surgical blades. She noticed when the security radio crackled, armed patient, heading toward ICU, do not engage. She noticed when the double doors burst open with a sound like a rifle shot and a man with wild eyes and blood on his hands came through, his breathing rapid and shallow, his entire body trembling with the particular violence that comes from a brain that stopped recognizing the difference between threat and civilian. His eyes locked on the bed where Captain Reeves was lying sedated, hooked to monitors and ventilators and 4 lines, and the look in his eyes said he recognized something. A face. A moment. Maybe from Ramadi. Maybe from a nightmare he couldn't stop having. The ceramic shiv rose in his right hand, the edge catching the overhead light. Elena moved. Not toward him. Between him and the captain. She didn't calculate probability. She didn't wonder if there was a better tactical response. She simply moved into the space where the blade was going to descend, the way you move into a fire to pull someone out, the way you move without thinking because thinking would slow you down and people died when you were slow. The ceramic punched through her scrubs like they were tissue paper. It was a clean entry wound, sharp and precise, and then it twisted slightly as the man tried to drive it deeper, and Elena felt the blade rake across bone, felt it punch through muscle, felt the world narrow down to the sensation of something foreign inside her shoulder cavity. The pain was information. Pain was data. Her left arm was now significantly less useful, but her right arm was fine, and her right arm knew how to do a pressure point takedown that she'd learned from a Marine gunnery sergeant in 2003. She used it now. His hand opened. The shiv fell. She drove him to the ground, held him there with her functioning arm, using leverage instead of strength, using the position that made struggle impossible. Security arrived in under 10 seconds, but she was already holding him, already keeping him pinned to the floor, her left shoulder screaming with pain that she filed away in the same place where she filed Whitfield's threats. Her scrubs were soaked from her left armpit down. Blood. Her blood this time. They took him to the psychiatric wing. They took Elena to the emergency department. Dr. Whitfield watched her go, watched the blood trail on the floor, watched the security team escort her down the hallway, and then he made another phone call. This one to the hospital's malpractice insurer. This one to the state medical board investigator he'd been cultivating as an ally for exactly this kind of moment. This one laying out the case that Elena Martinez was a liability, that she'd performed an unauthorized surgical procedure without credentialing, that she'd now been involved in a violent altercation, that her judgment was compromised, that her presence at Seattle General was becoming a legal and insurance nightmare that would be much easier to solve by terminating her employment immediately. The ER resident stitching up her shoulder, Dr. Jennifer Park, one of the good ones, kept saying this shouldn't have happened and you need to report this and this is assault, but Elena just watched the needle go through skin, watched the purple sutures close the wound, watched the monitor above her head show her heart rate at a steady 68 beats per minute, her blood pressure holding at 112/71, her oxygen saturation at 99% on room air. Controlled. Stable. The word she used for patience was the word that applied to her. At 02 for 5 hours, while she was still in the ER bay and the stitches were still fresh and the bandage was still fresh and the pain was still a hot knife moving through her shoulder, 2 security officers in pressed uniforms walked in with printed papers and the kind of embarrassed expression that suggested they knew exactly what they were about to do and exactly how wrong it was, but they were going to do it anyway because someone had signed off on it and that someone had a medical degree and worked on the 7th floor with the other doctors who had medical degrees. Elena Martinez, the first officer said. Not Master Chief. Not Elena. Just the last name, the way you address someone who doesn't belong anymore. The way you address someone who's already gone. The blade came in fast. Ceramic doesn't show on metal detectors, doesn't trigger security scanners, moves like a whisper through the air. Elena saw the patient's arm come up, psychiatric ward transfer, disoriented, PTSD fracturing into violence, and she didn't think. Her body moved on its own, muscle memory taking over from 1,000 nights in field hospitals where thinking got people killed. She stepped left. Just 6 inches. The shiv meant for Captain Reeves's chest found her shoulder instead. The pain wasn't sharp. Pain is data. Pain is information. The blade punched through soft tissue like a fist through wet canvas, and Elena felt the ceramic tip scrape against bone, scapula, the wing-shaped bone that carries weight. Blood. Fast. The scrub top darkened, a crimson stain spreading from her left shoulder like spilled coffee, widening across the fabric in a spreading circle that would have looked slow motion if you weren't the one bleeding. The intruder pulled back for a second strike. Elena's right hand moved first, snapped his wrist, and the ceramic shiv clattered to the ICU floor where it skittered beneath a monitor stand. Security was there in 8 seconds. The man went down, restrained, sedated. A trauma surgeon Elena had worked with 100 times was already assessing her shoulder, pulling back the bloody fabric, calling for the ER. She didn't remember walking. The ICU felt distant, sounds arriving as if underwater, alarms, footsteps, someone shouting code trauma, Trauma Bay 3, which didn't make sense until she realized they meant her. The stairwell was painted industrial gray. The ER lights were too bright. A nurse, another nurse, someone Elena had trained, was cutting away her scrub top, revealing the wound in clean fluorescent light. The bleeding had slowed. The shoulder was a mess of torn muscle and blood, but the blade had missed everything critical. Lucky. That's what the surgeon said. You're lucky. As if luck had anything to do with being fast enough, trained enough, willing to take a blade meant for someone else. 12 stitches. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. The surgeon worked with practiced efficiency, pulling the needle through torn tissue while Elena watched her own blood pool in a silver basin. The fluorescent lights hummed like something dying. The fur in her right arm felt cold, saline running, and someone had wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her bicep that tightened and released in rhythmic waves. She could hear the ER activity around her, voices clipped short, equipment beeping, the smell of antiseptic and copper mixing in the recycled air. The surgeon's hands moved with the same precision Elena's had moved in Ramadi, same calm, same understanding that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. It was 02 for 5 hours when security arrived at the trauma bay door. 2 officers. One of them, E. Marcus, she thought his name was, held a sealed envelope. I'm sorry, he said. I don't want to do this. Elena didn't look up from the 4 technician taping the needle down. Do what? We received instructions from Dr. Whitfield and hospital administration. Marcus's voice sounded like he'd swallowed gravel. These are your termination papers. Effective immediately. You're to surrender your badge and leave the premises within 30 minutes. She felt it then. Not the shoulder, that was just pain, manageable, data to be processed. She felt the 6 months of invisibility collapse like a building coming down. 6 months of perfect charting, perfect documentation, invisible work. 6 months of watching Captain Reeves recover, 6 months of naval intelligence asset protection, 6 months of a mission that mattered more than the blade in her shoulder mattered, more than employment mattered, more than anything except. Miguel's voice in her head. If anything happens to him, you'll be the only one I'd trust. She'd failed. The envelope felt thin in her right hand. Her left shoulder screamed as she turned, but her face stayed flat. The surgeon had finished at stitch 7. Blood was still seeping through fresh gauze. Elena looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw the shame in his face, the recognition of someone being wronged, and the powerlessness of watching it happen. I understand, Elena said. It wasn't a request. It was compliance. It was the voice of someone who'd played the game correctly and lost anyway. Dr. Whitfield had already sent the email to the hospital's malpractice insurer by 02:47 hours. Elena learned this later, reading the forwarded message on her personal phone 3 hours later in an all-night diner called Victory Drive Eats, where the coffee was lukewarm and the booth smelled like bacon grease and broken dreams. The email was clinical, precise, exactly the kind of documentation that sounded authoritative to someone who didn't know medicine. At 0200 hours, nursing staff performed an unauthorized thoracotomy without physician oversight, without surgical team assembly, without proper sterile technique. This represents a serious breach of protocol and puts the hospital at severe legal and financial risk. I am requesting immediate investigation by state medical board authorities and malpractice coverage review for potential denial of claims based on an authorized procedure. He'd attached photographs, security footage, times and dates. He'd built a case the way he'd built his billing empire, with meticulous precision and complete disregard for truth. The truth was that Elena had saved Captain Reeves's life. The truth was that the photograph showed medical competence, not recklessness. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative, unauthorized procedure, unqualified nurse, hospital liability. By 0300 hours, an investigator from the State Medical Board had been assigned. By 0400 hours, the hospital's outside counsel had begun preparing a defense strategy that involved fully cooperating with Dr. Whitfield's narrative, easier to sacrifice one nurse than defend the judgment call that saved a patient's life. Elena didn't know any of this yet. She sat in the diner with her arm in a sling, her shoulder wrapped in gauze that was already seeping blood at the edges, her scrub top folded in a plastic hospital bag with a discharge summary. The waitress is a woman probably in her 60s with grey streaked through black hair and the kind of tired that came from working the graveyard shift for 2 decades, refilled her coffee cup without asking. You want anything to eat, honey? Elena shook her head. The coffee wasn't good, but it was hot, and heat felt like something real in the 0430 darkness. Outside Victory Drive, the city of Savannah was still asleep. Rain had come through an hour earlier. Elena had watched it pound the parking lot in sheets, drumming on the diner's roof like applause or gunfire, she could never decide which. The rain had stopped now. The street was empty except for a semi idling at a traffic light 3 blocks away, its engine rumbling like a predator's growl in the silence. Elena's phone glowed on the Formica table next to her, 7 missed calls from an unknown number, which meant her naval intelligence handler. 2 text messages asking for status updates. 1 final message, asset protection primary objective. Clarify your position. Confirm operational status. Clarify her position. She'd been fired. She'd blown her cover. She'd lost access to Captain Reeves, which meant she'd lost the ability to monitor him for potential security breaches, which meant the entire surveillance mission was compromised. She was supposed to extract within 48 hours. She was supposed to disappear from Savannah like she'd never existed. But Miguel's last message sat at the top of her text thread, timestamped from 3 months ago. Mom, Captain Reeves saved my life in Ramadi. If anything happens to him, you'll be the only one I'd trust. She could leave. Protocol said leave. Her handler was waiting for her to confirm extraction timing so they could arrange transportation off base. Her mission was over. The objective was. The wind picked up outside, pushing rain against the diner windows. Elena watched her reflection stare back at her from the dark glass, a woman in borrowed scrubs, arm in a sling, shoulder bleeding through white gauze. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be to a fired nurse, disposable, replaceable, already forgotten. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Dr. Whitfield was already building his defense. That by 0600 hours, the State Medical Board would have photographs of her performing a life-saving procedure without authorization. That by 0800 hours, hospital administration would be preparing to throw her under the legal equivalent of a bus. That Whitfield had protected himself by making her the threat instead of admitting that his fraudulent billing was the actual crime. He'd maneuvered perfectly, moving from social attacks to strategic positioning to full sabotage in the span of 6 hours, and Elena had walked right into the trap because she'd been too focused on saving a patient's life to anticipate a colleague destroying her career. The challenge coin sat on the Formica table. It was tarnished now, 17 years of being carried in cargo pockets, being gripped in moments of stress, being pressed against skin during nights when sleep wouldn't come. The coin showed the Special Forces insignia, a trident barely visible beneath the patina. Elena had carried it since Ramadi, since the night Miguel handed it to her before his first deployment. "So you remember that someone loves you more than the mission," he'd said. She'd carried it through every operation, every extraction, every moment of doubt. She picked it up now, felt the weight of it, maybe 2 ounces of metal, maybe 2 decades of accumulated meaning. The waitress was watching her, the way good waitresses do, the way they see people in pieces and try to understand what broke them. Elena didn't make eye contact. She left a $20 bill on the table for a $5 coffee, and she stood up, and her shoulder screamed, and she didn't let her face change. The parking lot was still wet from the rain. Her car was a 2015 Honda Accord in hospital employee parking, utterly forgettable, exactly the kind of vehicle designed to be invisible. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, rain-dampened air moving across her face, and she made a decision that would end her career with naval intelligence and begin something else entirely. She wasn't leaving Savannah. Protocol be damned. Her son's commanding officer was still recovering in Seattle General, still vulnerable, and Dr. Whitfield was still out there, already calling investigators, already poisoning every documentation she'd created, already erasing her from the narrative. Elena started the car. The engine caught with a low rumble. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know that in less than 4 hours, the hospital would receive a call from someone at the naval base. That 200 service members would walk through Seattle General's doors like a force of nature. That everything Dr. Whitfield had built would come apart in minutes. She just drove, her left arm throbbing, her right hand steady on the wheel, moving through Savannah's pre-dawn streets toward a hospital where she wasn't allowed to go, toward a patient she wasn't allowed to protect, toward a moment when the quietest person in every room would finally stop being invisible. The state investigator arrived at Seattle General on the second morning, his badge reading Daniel Morrison, Federal Healthcare Fraud Division. He'd come to investigate Dr. Whitfield's complaint against Elena Martinez for performing an unauthorized surgical procedure. A routine case. 18-year-old protocol violation, case number logged at 08 for 7 hours. Morrison had done this 100 times. Walk in with papers. Interview the suspect. Document the violation. Close the file. But standing in a lobby filled with 200 service members in full dress uniform, watching a Master Chief Petty Officer in scrubs directing post-op care with the precision of a commander running a warship, Morrison began asking different questions. He requested Dr. Whitfield's complete patient billing records for the past 12 months. Standard protocol. Standard request. What Morrison discovered in the first 2 hours of document review made him place his coffee cup down very carefully, as if sudden movements might disturb what he was reading. Phantom consultations. Procedures billed to patients who'd never received them. A cardiothoracic surgeon consulting on patients in the psychiatric ward, patients with no cardiac conditions. Surgery dates listed for days when Whitfield had been in conferences across the state. The emails started appearing as Morrison cross-referenced billing codes against actual patient records. Medical supply company on the letterhead, Sterling Health Solutions. Equipment orders totaling $473,000 for supplies that never arrived at Seattle General but appeared on invoices to Whitfield's private practice. The coordinating emails were there, time-stamped, casual in their criminality. Another unit needed for Dr. W.'s Savannah location. 20% standard. Another email, 3 weeks later. Deposit cleared. Unit 7 routing to your personal account. Another. Quarterly shipment approved. Client appreciates continued partnership. The trail of fraud wasn't buried. It was filed in plain sight, protected only by the assumption that no one would look. By 1100 hours, Morrison had called the hospital's chief compliance officer and the board's legal counsel. By 1300 hours, Whitfield had been suspended pending investigation. By 1800 hours, federal healthcare fraud investigators had seized his office files, his computer, and his personal phone. The investigation that Whitfield had weaponized to destroy Elena Martinez now turned on him like a blade with two edges, cutting the hand that held it. Whitfield stood in the Seattle General parking lot at sunset, watching through the hospital's glass windows as Elena, badge reinstated, continued her shift in the ICU. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from the particular tremor of a man watching his empire collapse in real time. He tried calling board member Harrison, one of his 3 guaranteed allies, the ones who owed him favors stretching back 7 years. The call went to voicemail. He called board member Chen. Same result. His office door was locked by 1845 hours, security having changed the codes while he was in the administrative conference. His medical license suspension notice arrived via text message at 2104 hours. Not an email. Not official paperwork. A text. As if the system couldn't be bothered with formal delivery for something this conclusive. The weapon he had forged, the investigation, the outside scrutiny, the federal paper trail demanding answers, had turned completely on him. Everything he'd built over 14 years. The profitable fraud empire. The reputation cultivated through board donations and discreet favors. The untouchable position. It evaporated in 16 hours because he had drawn attention to the one person in Seattle General whose competence couldn't be questioned, whose character couldn't be undermined, whose past was protected by classification stamps from the Pentagon itself. That night Whitfield sat in his car in the parking lot, engine idling, watching the lit windows of the ICU where Elena moved between patients with the fluid certainty of a master surgeon. His hands shook as the reality settled. The master chief he'd tried to eliminate had never fought back. She'd simply stood there, composed and precise, while his own system consumed him. She'd performed one surgery that saved a captain's life. That single act of competence, combined with the scrutiny her excellence had attracted, had exposed everything. Not because Elena had complained or lobbied for investigation, but because excellence, when it's real, doesn't need defenders. It survives exposure. Everything else doesn't. 18 months would pass before his fraud trial concluded with a plea agreement that kept him out of federal prison on the condition that he never hold another medical license, that he surrender his DEA registration, and that he repay the hospital system and insurance companies $847,000 in fraudulent billings. The deal his attorneys negotiated was merciful only in its speed. His career didn't just end. It was erased. Elena sat in the same booth of the same diner on Victory Drive 18 months later, watching through the window across the street. The sky had turned the particular shade of gray that comes only at late afternoon in Savannah, when the heat finally breaks and the Spanish moss begins to glow like it's collecting light instead of blocking it. She wore navy dress whites, Master Chief insignia crisp on her collar, the gold anchors catching the fluorescent light from the diner's overhead fixtures. Through the window, she watched Dr. Whitfield at a folding card table outside a strip mall, the kind of card table that collapses down to something you could fit in a car trunk. On it sat stacks of supplemental insurance brochures, the paper already sun-faded, the corners curling from humidity. He was showing pamphlets to a woman in a grocery store parking lot, his movements carrying the particular desperation of someone selling something no one wants to buy. The woman shook her head, walked past. Whitfield's hands made some gesture, a small selling motion, and then dropped to his sides. His medical license permanently revoked. His fraud trial concluded. His empire reduced to a metal chair, a folding table, and a sun-faded banner that read Sterling Health Solutions, your family's future. The waitress, the same one from that 0300 hours shift 18 months ago, refilled Elena's cup without being asked. Hot coffee this time, not the cold cup that had sat untouched while Elena stared at her reflection in the window and made the choice to protect her mission. The waitress set the cup down and smiled in that way that people do when they're remembering something they'd rather forget. "You look better than last time you were here," she said. Elena nodded, and the waitress moved on to another table. Elena picked up both challenge coins from her jacket pocket, Miguel's from Ramadi, and the one Captain Reeves had given her on the day she was reinstated, the day the hospital director had offered her something more than her old position back. She felt their weight in her palm, cool and solid and true. $20 bill on a $5 coffee, the same pattern as before, a ritual now. She left it on the table and drove back to Seattle General through streets that were finally beginning to show the first hints of autumn. 20 former combat medics waited in the classroom when she arrived, all of them with the particular bearing of people who'd performed medicine under fire, who'd stitched arterial bleeds in convoy trucks, who'd run full lines while rounds came through walls. They sat in rows of 6, and the first thing Elena noticed was their posture, the kind of hypervigilance that never fully leaves you, the way their eyes tracked her entrance like soldiers assessing a commander. She'd been placed as director of the new Combat Medic Transition Program, a position the hospital director had created specifically for her, understanding without being told that Elena's expertise came from somewhere far deeper than civilian medical training. She trained people like herself. People whose competence seemed excessive until you learned where they'd practiced it. In Ramadi. In Kandahar. In the Panj River Valley. In places where the difference between a nurse's steady hands and panic meant the difference between someone's child coming home or coming home in a flag. The first lecture was always the same. Elena stood at the front of the classroom, both challenge coins on the desk beside her, Miguel's tarnished from 3 years of being carried in a combat pocket, Reeves's pristine but deliberately worn smooth by her own hands these past 18 months. She picked up both, held them where the class could see the metal catching the light, and began with words she'd learned through blood and survival and the particular clarity that comes from choosing mission over self. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived it, who had been that person, who had bled for it. Around her, 20 former combat medics leaned forward, and in that moment, every one of them understood that they weren't being trained by a nurse. They were being trained by a legend who had chosen to teach them how to survive the transition from war to peace, from battlefield to hospital, from the extraordinary pressure of keeping people alive in the worst possible conditions to the equally extraordinary pressure of convincing civilians that their competence was genuine and not some trauma response. Elena set the challenge coins back down on the desk and opened the first module. Behind her, through the window, Savannah's afternoon light began its slow fade toward evening, and somewhere across the city, a man at a card table watched another potential customer walk past without stopping. The world had balanced itself. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But balanced in the way that matters, where the people who give everything get to keep teaching, and the people who take everything get to understand, finally, what it costs. If you found yourself rooting for Elena, if you wondered what you would have done in her position, please subscribe to see more stories about the quiet heroes who make impossible choices. Like this video and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?